So what happens when romantic frustration boils over and becomes a grand economic theory of, well, everything? In this explainer, we are diving deep into the controversial worldview from the book Land of the Losers. It's written from the perspective of a self-described nice guy, and let me tell you, it offers a raw, unfiltered, and pretty startling explanation for the challenges of modern dating. So let's get into it.
To really get inside his head, we're going to follow his journey. First, we'll start with the personal tragedy that he says kicked this whole thing off. Then we'll dissect his core theory about sex being a commodity. From there, we'll look at the American dating experiences he uses as his evidence, contrast them with a really pivotal trip he took abroad, and then finally we'll see the dramatic takeaway that basically reshaped his entire view of the world.
You see, according to the author, his entire philosophy doesn't start with some abstract idea. Nope, it starts with a deeply personal tragedy. The story of his best friend, a guy he describes as the ultimate nice guy.
For the author, this entire puzzle really crystallizes in a dream he had after his friend Roger's death. In this dream, Roger shows up and asks this one single haunting question. And it's this question that the rest of the book is basically dedicated to solving.
So here's the story as the author tells it. He paints this picture of Roger as a model human being, smart, kind, genuinely decent. But he was always consistently put in the friend zone. And this all came to a tragic head after his death in what's described as a gun accident. For the author, this gap, this huge gap between what a great guy Roger was and his total lack of romantic success, it becomes an all-consuming obsession.
And this question right here, this is the engine for everything that follows. The author isn't just sad, he's angry. He comes to a pretty stark conclusion. There was absolutely nothing wrong with Roger. He decides something must be fundamentally broken with the dating system itself, and that becomes the launchpad for his grand theory.
Okay, so how does he answer that question about his friend? Well, with this sweeping economic theory that he applies directly to relationships. He basically argues that if you want to understand modern dating, you have to stop thinking about romance and start looking at sex like it's a market commodity. He calls this theory the female cartel. Now, to be super clear about his argument, he's not saying there's some secret meeting where women are all conspiring together. Not at all. Instead, he claims it's the subconscious collective behavior, where women, as a group, control the supply of sex. And the goal, in his view, to drive up its value, making men, and these are his words, pay through the nose for it with attention, resources, and commitment. To really hammer this point home, he uses the pre-direct analogy, which you can see right here. He compares the entire sexual marketplace to the oil market controlled by OPEC. In his framework, women are the cartel, and they're working together to restrict the supply of a really valuable commodity, sex, all to keep its price high. So you might be thinking, how would a cartel like this even enforce its rules? Well, according to the author, the mechanism is social pressure. He claims any woman who cheats on the system by, offering sex too freely and effectively lowering its market price gets punished by other women. They get labeled with words like slut or cheap and get ostracized. He argues this serves as a powerful warning to everyone else to keep the supply tight. And the author points to his own life for what he sees as proof of this transactional system. He tells this story about an argument with an ex-girlfriend, who he gives the pretty derogatory name whorebag in the book. He says she withheld sex after he refused to buy her something. For him, this was a light bulb moment, a direct, explicit example of sex being used as leverage. All right, this brings us to the personal stories he shares about his relationships with American women. He basically lays them out one by one like a series of case studies that, in his mind, are just concrete proof for all of his theories. First up, we have Harriet. She was the first woman he ever slept with, and he says they met through a surprisingly old-school way, one of those college dating questionnaires that was designed to match compatible students. But from his point of view, the relationship quickly became a total drag. He describes feeling like he was basically playing the role of a therapist for all her past traumas, an emotional crutch, as he puts it, and he wasn't getting any joy out of it. He's also pretty blunt that he wasn't physically attracted to her. When he finally broke it off, he remembers it as this messy affair where he just ended up being called a jerk. Next up is Tracy. He met her online and describes her as a real cutie with a great smile. So totally unlike his experience with Harriet, he says he felt this immediate, wonderful connection, which set the stage for what he thought was going to be a real relationship. He frames this whole experience as a classic bait and switch.
They have what he calls a perfect weekend together. He's totally ready to do the whole long-distance thing, and then bam, just 2 weeks later, he finds out she's engaged to someone else. He's just left completely confused, and he concludes he must have just been her last fling before settling down.
His final American case study is Mi-Jun, a Korean graduate student he met at his university. He says that at first, he thought, okay, this could finally be the kind of girlfriend he was looking for. But there was one detail that made him suspicious. She insisted that their relationship had to be a complete secret.
He basically paints this picture of a relationship that was all about convenience for her. He talks about being kept a total secret from all her friends. He says he helped her with schoolwork, even loaned her money. And what did he get in return? He gets unceremoniously introduced to her new, official boyfriend. For the author, the takeaway was simple and brutal. He felt he had been completely used. But then, the author travels abroad, and his experiences with women, especially in Taiwan, create this huge contrast that completely changes his way of thinking.
He meets a woman named Jeane, and he's just blown away by how direct she is. After they sleep together, she just straight up asks to be his girlfriend. He describes it as having no games, no coyness, just this straightforward expression of what she wants, which he found incredibly refreshing after everything he'd been through in America.
And then he meets Jianglin, and this is what he presents as the absolute emotional peak of his entire journey. He describes her as being so overwhelmed with affection for him that she literally bursts into tears, begging to make love. He writes that in that moment, he felt like a god. He was experiencing this level of adoration and emotional vulnerability he was convinced just didn't exist in America.
Okay, so he's got these dramatically different sets of experiences in his head. He returns to the United States with a new and final worldview.
He writes that the very moment his plane lands back in Los Angeles, he looks at the people around him and has this one thought. Yep, back to crapola. He describes feeling this immediate wave of disappointment, believing the women he saw now just looked insipid and bland compared to the idealized memories from his trip. And this, right here, is his ultimate conclusion. He decides that Jeane and Jianglin will become his secret measuring sticks. They represent a 9.9 benchmark of affection and honesty that, from that moment on, he uses to judge every single American woman he meets. An idealized and, you could argue, maybe an impossible standard.
So after breaking down this one author's journey, from personal tragedy all the way to a global theory of dating, we're left with a bigger question. Whether you agree with his conclusions or you find them deeply flawed, what does a worldview like this actually reveal? What does its very existence tell us about the fractures, the frustrations, and maybe the profound misunderstandings that can happen in the search for modern love?